In this video, we will use data to analyze what the best Pokémon-ex are from the Space-Time Smackdown set. We previously looked at what we projected to be the top 10 best non-EX Pokémon, and we had some misses there, especially concerning Magnezone. If you're interested, check out that video. However, this time, we now have actual tournament results to utilize, so we expect to be much more accurate this time around. We gathered this data from a variety of sources down below, including Logan Thorne's meta report from last weekend. If you haven't watched his breakdown, we highly recommend you do so, and we have linked his video down below. We'll be referencing his conclusions throughout, so please do head over there and give him some love. That said, if you enjoy our content, please do like and subscribe. Coming in at number 10, we have perhaps the weakest Pokémon-ex in the new expansion, Mismagius. Mismagius suffers from a few key issues in the current format. The only tournament result we were able to get our hands on was an 0-3 run in Pocket Turtle, where the player Rezi faced 2 Darkrai decks and 1 Palkia deck. Rezi looked to play a Mismagius line with 3 1-ofs in Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, taking 0 wins and being the lone player of Mismagius cements this Pokémon-ex as a bit of a flop early on in the meta. So why is that? Well, there are 2 reasons primarily. Number 1 is that the current meta is absolutely dominated by Darkrai. More on that later. Looking at Logan Thorne's meta report from February 3rd, we can see that the premier Psychic deck, Mewtwo, experienced its worst matchup spread since the game came out, 41.67%. And Mewtwo itself is significantly stronger than Mismagius. This is to say that if the premier Psychic deck cannot cut it because of the prevalence of Darkrai EX, then Mismagius stands no chance. The second core reason is that Mismagius is simply extremely weak. It has a 2 energy attack, dealing 70 damage with 140 HP. These values are not enough in the current meta. It is easily one-shot by Palkia, and can be reliably 2-shot by Darkrai or Weavile, all of which are everywhere. It also loses to other cards like Gyarados and Mewtwo EX. Since it cannot hit back hard, it is supposed to rely on the Confusion status condition. In Pocket, Confusion requires that you coin flip before attacking. On a heads, you tack. On a tails, you don't, and the turn ends. This may sound like a great way to blank attacks, but with no real threat, a 50% chance for the opponent to KO the weak Pokémon-ex doesn't cut it. Furthermore, with so much damage coming from the bench in terms of Darkrai, and the prevalence of easy tempo with Leaf, it is hard to lock down one Pokemon in the active slot to remain confused, as once it gets to the bench, it loses that status condition. Overall, Mismagius is a bit of a mess, and while it has an interesting design, it cannot stack up against such a heavily dark-favored metagame. The other big miss in terms of Pokémon-ex from Space-Time Smackdown comes in the form of Pachirisu EX in our number 9 spot. Pachirisu's issue is mainly that it is a weaker version of Pikachu, and a metagame that is quite hostile to Pikachu. Pachirisu deals 40 damage plus 40 more if a tool is attached for 2 electric energy. Pikachu, on the other hand, deals up to 90 damage if you have 3 electric Pokemon on the bench. Pachirisu otherwise has the exact same stats as its counterpart, at 120 HP and 1 retreat cost. Realistically, since both of them have conditions that are roughly the same variance to meet, the only difference is that Pachirisu deals 10 less damage each turn. We were unable to find any deck playing Pachirisu in a tournament, so if you know of one, please comment down below how it went. However, we did see a Pikachu deck in the meta report from Logan Thorne, so analyzing that, we can see Pikachu did marginally better than Mewtwo at 44.20%, which we used as a stand-in for Mismagius previously, hence why we placed Pachirisu 1 spot above. The problems facing both decks are their extremely low HP stat for Pokémon-ex at 120, and the fact that there is so much chip damage in the meta right now, that Pachirisu and Pikachu cannot really sit in that active slot and soak damage like other Pokémon-ex. For instance, our Darkrai EX ability proc, plus a Giovanni and a Weavile attack, is exactly enough to knock out either one of those electric rodents, which can easily be done in the same amount of time it would take to get both set up. The best deck we could find to run Pachirisu used Pikachu EX as well, and since more spots are taken up by tools to allow for Pachirisu to use its ability, this means Pikachu is less likely to go off, meaning just overall is less consistent. Without tools to boost damage, there is just no reason to run Pachirisu over Pikachu, which is probably why we don't see the former in the meta, and people are just running Pikachu instead if they want a hyper aggro electric deck. Our prediction right now, very early on, for the next set, is that there are going to be some Pokemon tools that boost damage, and if that is the case, then we will see Pachirisu performing a little bit better in the meta. For our number 8 slot, we have the second to last unrepresented Pokémon-ex in Licky EX. We think Licky is a tier above the last 2, because while it's yet to see play to our knowledge, there's definitely some high roll potential with its attack, Licking Fury. Licky is also on the tankier end, sitting at 120 HP, meaning it is not as vulnerable as the last 2 Pokemon, and it being colorless allows it to flex into any color of any deck as an additional axis by which to operate on. Its attack deals 100 damage baseline plus 40 for each heads you flip until you flip tails for 4 energy of any type. While this seems like a lot, the best deck we have found uses Dialga to power it up with metal energies, so it's more approachable than it may first appear. We also use the genetic Apex Lickitung, which has functionally the same attack as well, just weaker in case we need to use it. Lickitung is perfect if you want to gamble on a one-shot, which with 1 heads is possible into much of the metagame. However, having a baseline damage of 100 is extremely helpful in Necessity's utility, because unlike other coin flip Pokemon like Marowak-EX, it always does damage. It seems like a fun, unexplored Pokemon with a high ceiling. However, there's a lot more you can be doing for 4 energy, even with Dialga's acceleration. This lands it at the number 8 slot. In our number 7 slot, and last Pokemon EX before the meta-represented Pokemon EX, is Gallade EX. Gallade hasn't seen a huge representation in the meta, and we are unable to find performing deck lists with this card. However, that doesn't mean Gallade is weak. Rather, Gallade looks to be specifically created to counter high energy stacking decks like Celebi EX. Gallade has a solid HP stat of 170, which means Celebi EX needs to hit at least 4 heads if Gallade is healthy, regardless of whether or not Giovanni was used. In addition, Gallade's attack, Energized Blade, does 70 damage plus 20 per energy attached. Therefore, assuming both Pokemon without Pokétools are ramping at the same speed, Gallade will be able to one-shot Celebi before Celebi has a chance to one-shot Gallade. Considering in 3 turns, Celebi will have 3 energy, enough for Gallade to deal 130 damage, which is Celebi's HP. Gallade can KO Celebi even earlier if there is a superior on the opposing bench or a Lucario on its bench. This leads us to believe that Gallade was basically created as a direct counter to Celebi and Celebi-like strategies that prefer to stack energies on one Pokemon. This said, it is a bit confusing as to why Gallade isn't played more in the meta. There are phenomenal fighting type tools at a player's disposal to augment Gallade and provide additional axes by which to operate on. Pokemon like Hitmonlee and Marshadow are powerful basic Pokemon from the previous format that could augment Gallade in a fighting toolbox deck, or at least that's what we thought. Currently, there's a lot of indirect damage spread out through cards like Rocky Helmet and Darkrai EX. This reduces Marshadow's use cases as it needs the previous Pokemon to be knocked out by an attack to utilize its bonus damage. Furthermore, Hitmonlee has lost its utility as the premier bench sniper, as Gyarados is no longer the S+ tier deck. It's a different one we will discuss later. In addition, even if it were, the introduction of Giant Cape buys Magikarp enough time to survive a hit and evolve. This conclusion is supported by the fact that the only performing fighting deck runs neither of these cards, and instead is a swarm deck using Lucario, Hitmonchan, which we previously said was useless in our base set card art video, go check that out, and Rampardos, all of which do consistent damage for 1 or 2 energy. This leads us to what we consider the most viable Gallade deck, which runs just the Gallade line and then the Druddigon with the Giant Cape, Rocky Helmet, and Leaf for Stall, as well as Pokemon Communication, Pokeball, and Professor's Research for consistency, which you'll see in many of these lists. This list seeks to use the strategy common in the last format, which would be to sit behind Druddigon while building up the strong finisher in the form of Gallade to close out the game. Overall, we believe the reason why this list isn't performing as well is the strategy just hasn't adjusted to the new format, and therefore once it does, we believe Gallade may see some meta share. Until then, it is sitting just outside of the meta viable at number 7. Just barely achieving meta relevance at number 6 is Infernape EX. Infernape is a relatively tough Pokemon at 170 HP, with a notable 0 retreat cost and 140 damage dealing move in Flare Blitz for 2 energy, with the downside of discarding all fire energy from Infernape. There are 2 deck lists, one that runs Dodrio as another low investment damage dealer with no retreat cost, and the other more common list using Moltres EX and Dawn to keep Infernape flush with energy. The latter had a higher tournament representation, as even though the Dodrio variant seems more aggressive, the Moltres variant is much more consistent, and as such, we will focus on the Infernape use case with Moltres. Generally speaking, Infernape needs some kind of energy acceleration in order to keep up damage, which is why the Moltres variant is preferred, as the generalized strategy is to use Moltres on your first turn to get some energies on Chimchars on the bench, then once Infernape is live, to bring out Infernape to deal its 140 damage, then retreat it back for no cost to Moltres and recharge Infernape, rinse and repeat. This has helped in terms of consistency through Pokemon Communication, as well as the fact that both Chimchar and Monferno have 1 energy damage attacks, so some chip damage can be dealt prior to Infernape coming out. In the tournaments last weekend, Infernape saw a 1.28% representation, which is quite low, and a win rate of 48.55%, which is only better than the pure Dialga EX decks and the floundering Pikachu and Mewtwo EX decks. The majority of that win rate was concentrated in the extremely favorable matchups into Dialga at 91.67% and Executor at 65% respectively, which have a type weakness, and then the Yanmega deck at 78.57%, which is outsped and outdamaged by Infernape. Unfortunately, Infernape innately has extremely poor matchups into all Darkrai variants, as well as Charizard, Palkia, and Gyarados, which are some of the most prevalent decks in the format. This poor matchup spread against what is effectively about a third of the format means that Infernape is gate-kept from the higher tiers and sits at number 6 until an answer is discovered. Coming in at number 5 is Yanmega. Even though it is at the midpoint of this list, Yanmega seems to be an extremely underexplored strategy in the meta, and we believe will experience a meteoric rise in the near future. It currently sits just at the bottom of meta relevance, as it experienced a 2.16% deck share in the recent tournament circuit. It also reported a respectable 52.30% win rate as well, showing that it was punching a bit above its weight. It appeared to be typically in a standard grass package with Executor EX. The idea for this is for Executor to open and tank hits, since Yanmega has a relatively low HP pool of 140 for a Stage 1 Pokemon EX. Its Air Slash does 120 damage for 3 colorless energy, and then it discards a random energy from Yanmega, which requires you to then add more energy every single turn. However, the 120 breakpoint is extremely significant as it can one-shot both Weavile EX and Darkrai EX, which are extremely meta-prevalent since they are weak to grass and boosts 120 to 140, which is their whole HP pool. We believe that the generally highlighted list of Executor EX plus Yanmega is not the strongest variant. The benefit of Yanmega is encapsulated in the fact that it requires colorless energy rather than grass energy. This means it can benefit from energy acceleration cards like Dialga and Manaphy, which allow it to stay safe on the bench while energy is attached to it rapidly. As such, we think a list using Dialga EX as an opener to accelerate energy onto Yanmega and have Mew EX as a backup to use powerful attackers like Palkia against the opponent. It is an extremely flexible deck and perhaps one of the best uses of a 3-color engine facilitated by the consistent damage of Yanmega, the ramp of Dialga, and the flexibility of Mew EX. This fact alone that Yanmega can flex into 2 different powerful deck lists supports its placement at number 5. Perhaps one of the most disappointing Pokemon EX is our number 4 slot, Dialga. Dialga's deck list involving Melmetal, Tauros, and Mew EX clocked in at a 2.5% deck share and an average win rate of 46.93%. It struggles significantly against fire-based decks like Charizard and Infernape, as well as dark aggro decks like Darkrai and Weavile. However, it did manage to take 14th in the Hooglandia and Spraggles Open, which tells us that it can perform well. It just needs a strong pilot who can pivot with Mew EX when needed. This tells us that Dialga can perform, it's just not fully realized yet. And why is that? Well, Dialga is one of the premier cards for energy acceleration released in the set, as its attack, Metallic Turbo, provides 2 mental energy to your bench Pokemon, and unlike something like Moltres or Manaphy, it is not gated by type. It works for every type. It also has the move Heavy Impact, which for 4 energy does 100, a very low amount for such a high energy investment. But when you consider the fact that you could be putting 4 mental energies on anything on your bench in the time it takes you to get Heavy Impact online, you will greatly outpace your opponents in the energy economy game. This is why our favorite Yanmega deck runs Dialga as an energy accelerant. Really, the Yanmega variant can be counted for either Yanmega or Dialga, which is why they're next to each other on the list. And we believe that this is basically how Dialga will end up, as a supporter card like Moltres for a deck that requires either colorless or metal energies. However, as it requires 2 metal energies to do its job, unlike Moltres EX, which requires 1, it is extremely vulnerable to decks that can dish out damage early, and this is why it's such a poor matchup into Infernape, with a 7.69% win rate, whereas against Charizard it has a 35.59% win rate, which is still not great, but it's 5 times as good. That said, we believe that Infernape has really hit the ceiling of what it is capable of in the current format. We are holding out hope for a Dialga, and that its potential will be realized in the coming weeks. However, we would not be surprised if Dialga continued to slip as Pokemon EX like Yanmega advance in the metagame, which is also underrealized in our eyes. Coming in at number 3, we have the last Pokemon EX before we see the top tier format defining Pokemon EX, by which all others are judged. This is Weavile EX. Weavile itself is an extremely strong and prevalent card, bolstered by Darkrai EX. It boasts the 5th highest deck share at 5.25% and an average win rate of 52.09%, which is pretty good for that deck share. 5.25% means you're 4 times as likely to see Weavile decks as you are to see Infernape decks, for instance. Weavile itself is an extremely fast card with 1 energy attack that does 30 damage, plus an additional 40 if there's already damage on that Pokemon. It has 100 HP, which is a little bit on the low end, and a 1 retreat cost as a Stage 1 EX Pokemon. In the Weavile deck list, you'll see other cards that facilitate its bonus damage, such as Rocky Helmet and Spiritomb. With Spiritomb, if you open with Swirling Disaster against a full bench, Cyrus allows you to pick and choose your targets, ensuring tempo advantage and KOs for a quick win. This deck is pretty strong and took first at the Froggy X tournament. The absolute strongest possible play for Weavile is to go first, evolve on turn 2, and attach a Dark Energy to Darkrai on the bench to deal 20 damage. Then don the energy back to Weavile to then hit for 70 right out of the gate. It is extremely fast, and a lot of decks struggle to match that damage once it gets going. The synergy between Darkrai and Weavile cannot be overstated. There are 3 main benefits of running the two together. 1, they're both dark, so no worries on energy. 2, they are both low energy investment cards, so with Weavile, once you have that 1 energy on it, you can consistently use Darkrai's ability to dish out 20 chip damage. Their attacks also then synergize amazingly together right out of the gate, as was previously explained. If not for the top tier Pokemon EX, Weavile would be number 1 in the format without a doubt. Now, as we approach the number 2 slot, we get to see the 2 best performing Pokemon EX in the current format based on the numbers. We would like to say that it was close to decide between the two, but it really wasn't. Palkia EX is our pick for the second best Pokemon EX in Spacetime Smackdown. At a whopping 7.65% deck share and an average win rate of 53.65%, Palkia EX is technically the second highest win rate out of the 10 Pokemon EX released in Spacetime Smackdown. When it comes to our number 1 slot, we'll explain why we say technically there. Palkia is extremely consistent with having positive matchups into everything except our number 1 slot, Pikachu EX, and Lucario Rampardos. This is because it can work with whatever it starts off with, and as a water type, has crazy energy acceleration. Whereas its counterpart in Dialga has 1 Pokemon that accelerates energies for a 2-cost attack, Palkia runs Manaphy, which for 1 water energy also accelerates 2 energies, especially when you have Vaporeon on your bench. In addition, Misty functionally has no ceiling to how many energy it can provide to Palkia EX. Unless you're my brother, in that case you always hit tails. Either way, this is great because Palkia has to discard 3 energy every time it uses its Dimensional Storm for 150 damage and 20 to the bench. So if you're able to put more than 3 onto Palkia right away, you'll be consistently hitting extremely hard. However, if you're unable to start with Manaphy and Eevee, you can just open Palkia for consistent 30 damage for 1 energy attached to a 150 HP body. The addition of Leaf ensures that once you have Manaphy in play, you can retreat Palkia for no cost. This is one of the few decks that don't run Dawn due to Vaporeon's washout ability, which allows for the addition of Cyrus to swap at whatever you want following Palkia's Dimensional Storm, and Giant Cape to ensure Manaphy and Palkia live a little longer. If not for the best deck in the format, Palkia would easily be number 1. However, due to a Pokemon lurking on a Generation 4 post-game island, the God of Space is relegated to 2nd place. And what might our number 1 best Pokemon EX be? If you guess Cresselia EX, you'd be right. Just kidding. No, it's obviously Darkrai EX. The gap between Darkrai and Palkia is the same as the gap between Palkia and Mismagius at number 10. 2 sets of stats put this in perspective. First, Darkrai EX experienced above 10% deck share, most out of anything, and had a 60+% win rate across its variants. Yes, variants. That is the second stat to focus on. There are many ways to play this card. The big one, and the one we'll be focusing on, is the Magnezone variant. However, you can play Darkrai with a Weezing Koga package, or with a Greninja package, which also is the only deck that won against the Magnezone variant, which is why we say technically to our previous spot. Or you can play with Weavile, as we discussed earlier, or with many others that are less represented. Overall, following the first weekend of tournaments, everyone was talking about Darkrai and Magnezone, which is, again, a bit embarrassing for us as Magnezone wasn't even on our radar for our top 10 projections for the best non-Pokemon EX. If you're interested in that, go check it out. Otherwise, Darkrai functions extremely well with Magnezone. When you play this variant, you have a Magnezone line with the Spacetime Smackdown Magnemite and the Genetic Apex Magneton. The reason being that Magnemite requires colorless energy, so in a pinch you can use it to attack since you only run Darkness energy in this deck. And then Magneton generates the lightning energy needed to use Magnezone's Thunder Blast ability. Also, Druddigon's in here for the extra chip damage and to be used as a strong 1 prize wall like it was in the previous format. Ideally, you get Magneton set up early behind a Drudge Wall with Darkrai on your bench. Going either first or second, it doesn't really matter. You begin putting energies on Darkrai to get that chip damage out as you evolve into Magneton as soon as possible, and you start using its ability. Once Drud is knocked out, your opponent takes their first prize and you send a Magnezone to blast them until it goes down for 110 damage, which only gives them then 2 prizes between those 2 Pokemon. Finally, Darkrai comes in and cleans up. It is extremely strong and consistent since it hits for 2 types, and it works its way through at least 2 1-prize Pokemon before an EX is in the active slot. The only weakness Darkrai has is something that can snipe it on the bench, hence why it loses to the Greninja variants, since they can bring it then out with Cyrus before it's ready. Overall, Darkrai is just insane and completely meta-defining. There really isn't much to say other than we really just need some form of grass counter to emerge. Whether that's the Ultimate Healing Venusaur EX, Executor EX, or Yanmega EX, it doesn't matter. Hitting a 60+ win rate into everything else is insanely strong and will likely dictate the format going forward. And that's the list. Did we miss anything? Let us know down in the comments if you think places should be swapped. Cresselia didn't make the list because it's probably the worst Pokemon EX we've gotten so far, especially in such a dark heavy meta. Either way, we'll catch you guys in the next video, and check out our other videos if you're interested in more.